Welcome to the Derek Diamond Experience podcast, where every week I take a look into the world of film and television with those who have lived it and experienced it. I am your host, Derek Diamond, and a subject that I've been talking about quite a bit on the show lately is story, specifically storytelling, script writing, and just the overall structure of what a story is and what it means to film. And I'm very happy to have my guest on this week because he is way more qualified to talk about that than I will ever be. It is award-winning author, screenwriter, producer, Mr. Tom Deschenes. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, Derek. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely. And I feel like I have to explain the story of how I was introduced to you because it's because of a subject that I rarely talk about on this podcast, and that is professional wrestling. We're both wrestling fans. You know, I grew up in the 90s, in the WCW, WWF, Monday Night Wars, was hooked from the very beginning, and years later we have all these wrestling podcasts hosted by, Bruce Pritchard, Eric Bischoff, and I subscribed to the ad-free shows that Conrad Thompson started, and I heard the breakdown of two cinematic matches that WWE has done recently, and you were a part of that. And as I was listening to the episodes, it's like, man, this guy, he knows storytelling like down to a science, so I've got to have him on the show to talk about stories. So I thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm so glad to meet another wrestling fan like you. It's not a topic that I usually talk about in public, and you kind of have to still, to this day, ask around, hey, are you a wrestling fan? You watch WWE, Ring of Honor? So it can be hard sometimes to find people who really appreciate the art form, but not only appreciate the art form, people who actually see it as an art form. There are lots of great wrestling fans out there who love it as a spectacle and as entertainment. But what really intrigued me from the very first time I saw pro wrestling on the television, it was the storytelling. And it was, the theatrical aspect of it, the dramatic aspect of it. And it's been pretty exciting for me, almost a dream come true. I'm now connected quite closely with Eric Bischoff, who, as you and I know, and any wrestling fans out there who are listening knows, former executive, the big head honcho at World Championship Wrestling. Led World Championship Wrestling to 83 weeks of cable dominance, the highest rated show on television, cable television for over a year, one of the top Turner executives. And it's been a pretty interesting journey. And it's crazy for me to have watched Eric on television and booed the heck out of him because he was such a heel. He was such a villain. And growing up, I couldn't stand that guy. And I was a WWE guy too, being from the Northeast. So not only did I dislike Eric, the heel character, but I also disliked WCW. I was WWF, WWE all the way. So it's kind of crazy that one of my childhood villains is now a close personal friend and someone who I'm glad was willing to have me on his podcast. We had a fun time with those breakdowns.
Absolutely, and it's funny because I'm on the opposite end because I'm from the South. So I started watching WCW first. And then months later was introduced to WWF. And then, flip-flopping between channels. People these days, you kind of get it with NXT and AEW right now, but it's not to that same effect that it was every Monday night when you would set TNT and USA to your channels and you would just hit the previous channel button on your remote anytime one would go to a commercial. You flip to the other one to see what the other show was doing. But I agree with you in the sense that it was the story that drew me in because people still, kind of frown on wrestling as it's fake and it's, all this other crap. But there have been some great storylines. Like, the Stone Cold Steve Austin, Vince McMahon storyline resonated with so many people because it was the everyman fighting the corporate boss. So many people can relate to that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there are some of the truly great wrestling storylines you could put up against any televisual storylines over the last, 20, 30, 40 years. I always loved the stories that are not only told leading up to the match, but in the matches themselves. Some that come to mind, obviously, Austin McMahon is like number one. It has to be. That's like the Shakespeare of pro wrestling storylines, just because of the amount of time. That storyline, the long-term storytelling there was probably about a year and a half, 2 years. and it continued on. And it's still to this day, if Mr. McMahon and Stone Cold are still on the screen together for like a 25th anniversary reunion show, you know they're picking up right where they left off as adversaries. So that was an incredible storyline. But I also love storylines like Bret Hart and Steve Austin back from like Survivor Series 96 through WrestleMania 13 and the double turn. I think the multi-year storyline with The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 25 and 26, and then against Triple H at 27 and 28. I mean, to me, those are storylines that to this day, I'm actually getting goosebumps right now, Derek, talking to you about it. Those are just some incredible storylines that to me go beyond, just wrestling. This is really great dramatic storytelling that dates back to the basics of what Aristotle had in his Poetics. You need mimesis, which means storylines that are realistic, storylines, to your point with Austin McMahon, that the everyman, the audience can actually relate to and connect to. You need to have storylines that are cathartic, storylines that really make you register certain emotions, whether it's pity or fear or excitement. You need characters that evolve but remain constant and true to form. And to me, you see all of that in these great wrestling storylines, just like you do in the greatest, Shakespeare plays or Dickens novels or epic poetry from Homer. And so it's always nice to connect with a fellow wrestling fan.
Absolutely. And it's something that, I don't talk about too often. So, and I know we could probably go on for hours about wrestling, but no, I agree with you. It's nice to connect with a fellow fan. Was wrestling specifically the thing that hooked you into being a huge fan of storytelling?
I would say it's the predominant thing. Yes. I never forget, and it's kind of funny because even my parents joked about this, when I was growing up, that I always needed to be I was one of those children that always needed attention. So I was a huge He-Man fan, and I had every He-Man and Thundercat you can think of, but I couldn't play with them on my own. I needed my dad to come get on the floor and play with me with the characters, or my mom or my sister. And I wasn't, a child that could necessarily go and busy himself on his own or do things independently until wrestling came around. And I think I told the story on Eric's podcast. I remember it was one night, it was a Saturday night's main event. My dad was kind of like falling asleep in his recliner. I was lying on the floor, just playing with some toys, and wrestling was on TV. And the match that just captured me, it was the Twin Towers, Boss Man and Akeem, these two big mammoth behemoth fighters up against Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage. I mean, at the time, these two superhero-like, just incredible, warriors. And there was this big back and forth match. And I'll never forget, at one point during the match, Akeem throws Macho Man Randy Savage to the outside, and he lands on top of the beautiful Miss Elizabeth, this princess-looking figure on the outside of the ring. And I remember then chaos just ensued. So Macho Man is down on the ground. He's beaten up. Hulk Hogan, the knight in shining armor, comes over, and rather than taking care of his tag team partner, he lifts Miss Elizabeth and walks her to the back to seek medical attention. And at this point, Randy Savage, he's up and he's groggy and he's confused. Where's his tag team partner? His tag team partner just walked away with his woman. He's got to fight these two big behemoths 2-on-1. And I was just so wrapped by the action, not only in the ring, but then what happened after the ring. We went behind the scenes, and after the match, Randy Savage attacked his tag team partner, Hulk Hogan, in the infirmary, and Miss Elizabeth is crying. And I remember there were like, it was almost like an operating table setup where there was like a platform of like operate like scissors. I just remember scissors being in there and them flying around. I was transfixed. And from that moment on, I was not only hooked on pro wrestling, but I was hooked on, playing with action figures and trying to tell similar stories, similar to the ones that I was seeing on TV. And yeah, when I started to get the Hasbro, action figures back in the day, I had a good collection of the LJN ones too. I still have a very soft spot for the LJN figures, the big rubber figures. But when I got the Hasbro figures, I could sit for hours and book my own storylines and book my own matches and book my own cards. And yeah, my parents still joke to this day, thank goodness you found wrestling. Thank goodness we got you those toys, because otherwise, who knows if I ever would have been able to do anything independently.
For those who are only listening to the audio version, like I've been smiling the entire time hearing these stories, just because I love hearing stories like that, because I think every fan, whether it's not just wrestling, but movies, anything, like any type of form of entertainment, if you work in the entertainment industry, that moment, you remember that moment like it was yesterday when you were hooked. For me, it was February of 1998, and the NWO was in full swing, and this guy with white face paint came down from the ceiling with a baseball bat named Sting, and he just cleaned house on the NWO, and I said to myself, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I was a 12-year-old kid at the time, and since then I've been hooked. So no, it's great to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if like me, Derek, and yeah, you said the perfect word there, hooked. I'm addicted. I've come to terms with it. I will be a wrestling fan for the rest of my life and proud of it and love it. But the industry does go in cycles. And that's one of the things that Eric and I have been talking about, and how, the current product nowadays, the storylines aren't quite what they used to be. And the long-term storytelling really isn't there. And I've found that that's hurt my fandom a bit. Now, I still stay on top of like all the latest wrestling news. I still watch the shows, but I don't get the same enjoyment out of it that I have in the past. But as any good wrestling fan knows, it's cyclical. We're kind of at the bottom of the wheel now. We know that just around the corner there will be an amazing new, twist in the world of wrestling, and then again it'll be as good as it ever was. We saw that in the 80s. We saw that in the late 90s. We're certainly due again. And I think one of the things that excites me so much about AEW wrestling, AEW, it's not the perfect product, but it's so fresh. It's so different right now from what WWE is putting out. There's long-term storytelling. There's great character development. And those are the reasons why I think I get more joy out of AEW's product today than anything WWE puts on, although I've been a longtime fan of NXT as well. But yeah, it's for those story elements as compared to necessarily what happens in the ring. And yeah, I think AEW right now is doing a better job telling the overarching stories. And I just love, it almost feels like the 90s again, the late 90s, the Attitude Era, and the time of the NWO and WCW, where it's like anyone could be a contender. You have Jericho and Moxley and Cody and Kenny Omega and all of these great talents that could any day be the world champion and could be in a feud with one another and could be telling great stories. I don't know if we're quite seeing that in WWE right now. They have some of the best athletes and wrestlers they've ever had, but there's no consistent character development. There really isn't that, feeling of like anyone could really grab the gold. So yeah, that lack of storytelling, that lack of character development kind of hurts the WWE's product nowadays, in my estimation.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. It's like you were in my mind and you pulled my thoughts out. So no, I totally agree. So as you get older, at what point did you decide, because you've written a book, you've designed a board game, you've also worked in film, which we'll definitely get to here a bit later on. But at what point did you realize that storytelling is what you ultimately wanted to work in?
Two things come to mind. The film Halloween, the John Carpenter classic,
Yep.
and the Lord of the Rings series. Those were really, when I look back at what set me on the path that I'm on today, it was really those two movie-going experiences. And I can't even say movie-going for Halloween, because there's no way my parents ever would let me see that in theaters. That came out well before I was born. But I'll remember it was maybe around 5th or 6th grade, and it was on Halloween night, and I think it was the USA Network that was showing Halloween. And I remember I didn't have a TV in my bedroom, at that age, so I had to sneak out to the kitchen, and I saw it was on, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's this scary horror movie on. It's Halloween night. I want to watch this. And I started watching it with the volume down low, so no one would hear what I was watching. And even though it was like a 9-inch, like super staticky antenna TV, like out in the kitchen, but it was the first time I'd ever been transported. It was the first time that I was no longer sitting on a hard wooden kitchen chair watching a little like staticky television. I was there. I was in Haddonfield. I was with Laurie Strode and Dr. Loomis the shape is, stalking them throughout the city on Halloween night, or throughout the neighborhood. And that to me was a moment where I said, I love the Halloween franchise. I love the characters. I love that one of the most influential series on me as a creator. So that was one of the moments where I said, this is so cool. I really, really like, I would love to create something like that. But it wasn't until The Lord of the Rings came out, which was when I was in college. I had no idea what The Lord of the Rings was before the movies came out in 2001. I'm almost embarrassed to admit this to you now, Derek, but I actually thought it was about like trapeze artists, or like the rings, like circus rings, or
Yeah.
that's all I thought it was. And then I started to see these commercials on TV for the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring movie, and it was a freshman year. We were looking for something to do, so we went out to see that movie, and that movie series just again not only transported me but made me say, I want to do that. I'm not going to stop until I can do that. And I think the other thing that really reinforced that for me was when the extended editions came out. I probably watched the featurettes on discs 3 and 4 more than I watched the actual film, even though I've seen the film a lot of times. And that to me was all of a sudden an opportunity to see, oh my gosh, so this is how people can make a career in the movie industry without necessarily being an Orlando Bloom leading actor, or a Peter Jackson super writer, cinematographer, director. And that was really, those were the two things that set me on that path. And I've been working on that path ever since. Although I must say, probably my greatest regret is never really rolling the dice and just moving out to the West Coast earlier to give it a try. I was always someone very pragmatic. Grew up in quiet rural Maine, probably the farthest from California, literally, if you look on a map, in the continental United States. So I always have had a steady job. I've worked in education pretty much my entire career after graduating from college. That paid the bills though, but on the nights and on the weekends, that's when I really started to pursue that dream, and it's been a fun journey.
It's funny you mentioned Lord of the Rings, because I was thinking about another trilogy a couple of days ago. My favorite franchise of all time is Star Wars. I remember watching Star Wars in the black box set on VHS. They all three were in black boxes, and I think Darth Vader was on the cover of like the final 3-movie set or whatever. And before each movie, it had a little featurette from different people who were involved with the making of the movie. And the first time I watched Star Wars, again, like I mentioned with Sting and WCW, I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. Yes. And the thing that I loved about the story, and I appreciate it now that I'm older, you and Eric Bischoff talk about the 3-act structure when it comes to story, beginning, middle, and end, for a film, a play, whatever the case may be. But the interesting thing with trilogies, and I'll throw Lord of the Rings in there as one of the bigger examples, along with Star Wars, each movie is its own act, because there are 3 movies. The first movie, it has to have its own act 1, 2, and 3, but it's also act 1 to a bigger overarching story. So I don't know, and I'm sure you feel the same way, but I can really appreciate trilogies that pull that off.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the interesting things. I've become a huge fantasy nerd now as a result. Star Wars is right up there with me too. I discovered Star Wars probably in like middle school, and yeah, it was an obsession of mine as well, and still is to this day. And yeah, what really amazes me now that I'm working on Quest for the Antidote, the board game that I developed, we're expanding that now into new media, working in that realm of fantasy. It's interesting you talk about the trilogy and Star Wars. When you listen to Tolkien talking about his creation of the Lord of the Rings, or read any of his past interviews, he talks about how it's really one story that he had to chop up into multiple parts, because it was just such a big story that continued to grow and then expanded truly out of the Hobbit and then into the Silmarillion as well. And so it almost blurs that line between the stories and really this epic world. And the same is true with Star Wars. When Lucas had the 9 initial story ideas plotted out, saying, all right, I've got one shot to make one of these movies, to enter into this world. Where am I going to enter? all right, we're going to do it with the original Star Wars, which you and I know was episode 4 and kind of smack in the middle of things. So it's interesting because when you're developing one of these worlds, every character that you bring into that world has its own history. Every character has its own motivation, and every character has their own arc. And so what's interesting is as you populate these worlds and more characters come into that world, you have to examine the connections from each character and how do their histories tie in. And then all of a sudden you notice that you've got this mega story, this mega world that's populated with all of these incredible arcs, all of these great settings, all of these great elements that need their own stories told. And yeah, you're right. I love a good trilogy or a nonology, I guess, in the sense of Star Wars. I think that would be a 9 part series. And yeah, the Harry Potter stories and everything too. I think, yeah, I love those stories where you're really not only entering a book, you're entering a world.
Yeah, and Harry Potter's a good example too and a lot of it is just the epic feel of it. And I'll throw Star Wars and Lord of the Rings in there too, just the big scale of meeting all these different characters and the intricacies and how they interact with each other. And it's, as I've started to really dive into the filmmaking side of ultimately what I want to do, I've written a script for one short film that I filmed a couple of years ago. And that was one of the, oh, thank you. One of the biggest lessons that I learned was, how do the characters interact with each other, and what is the, and I've learned this also from, I took Aaron Sorkin's masterclass in screenwriting, which is unbelievable. Anybody who wants to be a writer, I highly recommend that you take it. And I wish I did it before I did my movie, but the biggest lesson that I learned, and it's honestly the most simple, is that really what it comes down to is the character's intention and obstacle.
Right.
What does the character want to do, and what's keeping him from doing it? And you can boil down most storytelling to that simple fact.
Absolutely. Yeah, that masterclass is incredible. And I would highly recommend, too, if you get the chance, if you haven't taken it yet, Neil Gaiman's class as well. Granted, it's fiction writing as compared to screenwriting, but still there's so much overlay. And yeah, his was as effective, I felt, in really helping to get people to understand the importance of developing character, developing storylines, and really telling compelling tales that have meaning to them. But yeah, I love that Aaron Sorkin masterclass.
Yeah, same. Now, I can't recommend it enough. It was one of those things, like I remember I would work my 9 to 5 job, and then I start doing the master class, and I'll just get sucked in for hours. And next thing I know, it's 10 or 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, that's the fun. That's what I do in my spare time too. That's what I do for fun. Yeah, I love master class or reading books on storytelling and screenwriting, or reading some of the classics, watching movies. Like, yeah, it's funny when people are like, "Oh my gosh, you put so much time and effort into these projects, and you do all these side hustles and different things." And to me, that's fun. That's where I go to recharge. That's where I go to get excited. And I couldn't agree with you more. That masterclass is one of the best investments I've made in a long time.
Well, I think people who haven't done it don't understand, the sheer amount of work that it takes. Because I'll even throw in, this podcast an example. It's almost like a second job in its own way, because you have to book the guests, you have to set up all the audio and video gear if you do video, make sure that it's edited properly, make sure it goes online, gets promoted, all that type of stuff. Some people have people who help them out, whether it's, making promo graphics or editing, things like that, or if you do it yourself, it's really like a second job. And it's the same thing with, writing. I'm sure, when you wrote your book about Shakespeare, that almost felt like a second job in a way.
It did, because it took a lot of discipline and it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of I'll say, even though this might sound really conceited, but it's something that other people have said about that particular book. Groundbreaking work, so it was backbreaking and groundbreaking in a way. Shakespeare is a topic. I mean, there's no other writer whose works have been scrutinized as much as Shakespeare over the last 400 years. So it's hard to come up with something new to say about Shakespeare. And I remember, as I was getting closer to the end of my grad program at Harvard, saying, okay, it's time for me to start thinking, what's my master's thesis going to be about? What's my book going to be about? And I decided I was going to try to do Shakespeare, and I was going to try to do something that no one had done before. And what was really cool was I was able to find something that no one has yet explored in the world of Shakespeare, which I was super proud of. And yeah, that is. It's tough to say whether I consider that my greatest accomplishment or Quest for the Antidote, which is just beyond my wildest imaginations. Quest for the Antidote is the one thing that I was doing for fun. That I was just like, I'm going to create a board game. I never expected it to reach the levels it was at. On the contrary, there were other projects that, I was peddling around a few years ago that I was like, this is going to be the big breakthrough thing for me that it, puttered out. And, so I think that's one of the important lessons for people in the movie industry, in television, in writing books, that, go where the opportunity is, be open to that. I certainly could have resisted some of that opportunity with Quest for the Antidote. But if I didn't, if I had resisted, I wouldn't have gone on the incredible journey that I'm on, that I'm still in the very early stages of. We're exploring turning it into an animated series, feature-length film, an 11-part book series, a prequel series with just so much potential. That's really exciting. But still, yeah, that Shakespeare book is something that I'm really, really proud of. And yeah, it was a lot of hard work. I enjoyed it, but it was tough. If I was a millionaire and could do like anything with my spare time, I would be tucked away in some library basement, rifling through these old manuscripts from the 1600s. But I have to feed myself, so I've got to do more commercially viable work. But deep down for me, yeah, Shakespeare is just one of those. You can't tap that. You won't ever reach the bottom of Shakespeare. It is inexhaustible. And I love it. I would live in that sort of scholar world permanently if I could. So maybe one day.
Yeah, you never know. So tell everyone about your book. It's called Shakespeare's Paraliptic Characters. What was the you mentioned loving Shakespeare. How did you find this particular subject about Shakespeare to write about? And then just tell everyone what it's about.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've loved Shakespeare since high school. I studied a bit in my undergrad because I was an English major. You had to take a couple of Shakespeare classes, and then for the few years after my undergrad, I taught high school English just outside of Boston. And I always loved teaching Romeo and Juliet. That was the assignment that I ninth grade. Everyone had to read Romeo and Juliet, and I was predominantly a ninth grade teacher. And then when it came time to go on for my grad degree, I said, well, I'm going to really try to focus on Shakespeare. And the thing that really got me excited with Harvard in particular is they have some of the leading Shakespeareans in the world. Probably my scholar crush is Marjorie Garber. Shakespeare, after all, is a book that if anyone is a Shakespeare fan or thinking of getting into Shakespeare, it should be on your shelf. It's about 1,000 some odd pages, really tiny print, but it's so good. And there was an opportunity to take a class with her right out the gate, and I took it. And yeah, from that moment on, I was really, really hooked more than I even was before. And so I kept taking classes in Shakespeare whenever there was an opportunity to write, even in other classes about a topic where I could bring Shakespeare in. I did that. One of the classes I took was actually the Holocaust in literature and film. And I was able to do this really, really cool research story on how the plays of William Shakespeare led to the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. And what's cool about doing such a kind of out there, but really, really fascinating research topic is that something now that I have television companies wanting to adapt that for TV into an unscripted series. So it's kind of cool when your worlds collide a little bit. I've got this board game that can create this TV show, and this TV show is opening up this opportunity for this book that I have. And so I've done some really cool stuff with Shakespeare. But it was one of my last classes at Harvard. It was a course where we read pretty much all the works of Shakespeare in like a 10-week span. So we were reading through like 3-4 plays a week. And what was really cool in that is I was able to see, we were reading through them chronologically. There was a point in the middle of Shakespeare's career where he would introduce these characters who seemed like they were really, really important characters that all of a sudden would just poof, vanish without a trace. We would never really get any closure on those characters, or those characters who were introduced as central characters were just suddenly pushed to the margins. And I started to wonder, okay, this is strange. Why is he doing this at this point in his career, where he's becoming really experimental? And I started to look for trends and different things and kind of connect some dots. And what I noticed was there's this rhetorical device called paralipsis. And that's something that anyone who studied public speaking or political debate, paralipsis is a pretty popular thing. And it's when you introduce something, but then dismiss it quickly to draw attention to its absence and basically leave your reader thinking more about what was left unsaid. So it's almost like one of these weird sort of, like people say jazz, it's the notes that aren't played that really matter. And I was like, what does that even mean? I get it now, because that's basically, what like paralipsis is. So sometimes you'll see in a political debate, well, Senator, I'm not going to bring up your improprieties with your secretary, but moving along. And it's like, by introducing that piece and then dismissing it, you've made it more central and like the key, your key point, basically. And so that's a rhetorical device that Shakespeare actually used with his characters in their speeches and in the way they act. But what's interesting was that Shakespeare sometimes took those like the essence of a rhetorical device and almost imbued it into the themes of his play or into his actual characters. And what was interesting, I was able to make this really unique argument about how Shakespeare, by introducing these characters, establishing them as important, but then dismissing them, he was basically, making a key statement about the key themes of the play, and really making, again, what was unsaid truly the loudest message about the play. So what happens to a play like Julius Caesar when you eliminate Cicero, who's the one person in between Brutus and Caesar, who's the one voice of reason? He is, the representative of logic. What happens when you take him out of the play? It's chaos, and it devolves into warfare and bloodshed. What happens in the Henry the Henriad, Henry the Fourth, Part 1, Part 2, and then Henry the Fifth, when you take away Falstaff, the comedic aspect of the play. Henry then becomes a cold-blooded killer without his foil Falstaff there. So it was a really fascinating study to me. I think one of the benefits of it is it's really accessible. That's one of the key things I tried to do with it, not only to tackle this really abstract topic, but make it like accessible to anyone who picked it up and read it. So for anyone who's looking for like an entryway into Shakespeare, or even maybe a little bit of like sort of next level analysis, I'd recommend the book. It's available on Amazon. And yeah, it won Harvard University's Dean Prize in 2016 for outstanding Masters of Liberal Arts thesis in English. So it's been pretty well reviewed by some pretty big wigs in Shakespeare, and I couldn't be more proud of it. I'm really happy with how it came out.
Well, it's fascinating because it's one of those topics that you don't really think about, but when it's mentioned, it makes total sense. You mentioning, especially the political reference that you made about, oh, I'm not going to bring this up. But anyway, you're like, well, wait a minute. If you're not going to bring it up, why did you mention it in the first place?
Right.
So, but
right, exactly.
When you think of characters that show up, are important to, a certain extent, and then they leave for no reason, people are like, I don't know. It's one of those things that I don't think about really until someone brings it up. So I think that's a very fascinating, look at Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's been, talked about in so many mediums for so many years. To find a new way to discuss it is really fascinating. So that props to you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And what's interesting, I haven't done it yet, but I'd love to see how it would apply to other, like certain movies. Are there Star Wars characters that are introduced and then disappear? And I'm not saying that everyone who does this is a genius like Shakespeare. There's a good chance that sometimes a writer or a director either forgets about a character or just sacrifices the character because they realize, okay, I've built them up to be this important, but they're really not important to the rest of the story. So kind of like a Lady Stoneheart in, Game of Thrones, when the adaptation to television, it's like, oh, there's this great character, but we just have no room for her anymore. Sometimes characters are eliminated for that reason. But what I'm basically proposing here is, well, just press on those gaps and absences, and just see, is there any potential artistic reason for this? And if there is, follow that thread to see what you can discover. And yeah, we discovered a whole lot about Shakespeare, but who knows what other Paralympic characters are out there.
I think we found your next project: Star Wars Paralympic characters.
I know. Part of me is like, it's one of the reasons why Eric and I have only done 3 of those cinematic match breakdowns. I'm worried if we press too hard, maybe on some of the Star Wars films, we discover, oh yeah, Lucas just forgot about that character,
Yeah.
and maybe got rid of that character because they were no longer important to him. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, it is kind of true. As Eric and I have been doing these wrestling storyline breakdowns, we've realized that there are some, like the Money in the Bank, corporate Money in the Bank ladder match. We did that one, and I think we only went like 9 minutes because there was like nothing we could extract from it. It was like, ooh, that was really bad. Even if we push here or try to give them credit there's like not really much good storytelling going on.
It was
So,
very
yeah,
all over the place.
Yeah, it was, and so yes, that could be a good next project though. Looking for Paralympic characters in other media, I like that.
I dig that. Yeah. So let's talk about your film, One Team: Story of Lewiston High School Blue Devils. I watched the trailer for that before we started the interview, and I've kind of been going through a documentary phase because I find true stories to honestly be much more compelling than fiction. Because
Absolutely.
you when you think of stories that have really happened, some that might seem outlandish and crazy or just unbelievable, with fiction, you're like, oh, somebody came up with that. But if it's a documentary or a nonfiction story, you're like, wow, that actually happened. And when I was watching the trailer and reading the description of it, I felt like it was really relatable to what's going on in the world now with, all the social injustice that's going on. So tell me how you got involved with the making of this documentary.
Well, yeah, thank you for asking about that, because that too is a project that's really important to me, and I think to our time as well. And yeah, I'm a huge documentary fan. I agree with you. History and reality is even wackier and more interesting than fiction sometimes. And a lot of the great fiction is inspired by history. So what's great about documentarians is when they can actually capture one of those moments in history on film. And One Team has been a really, really unique journey. The director of the film, the true like figurehead and founder of One Team, is one of my best friends. His name is Ian Clough. He's a local filmmaker from Maine, and he had actually helped me film a pilot that I was doing about hunting for rare books. So it was really interesting. Ian and I, we weren't necessarily super close in high school, but we came together about maybe, almost 10 years ago now, because I had all these wacky ideas, but I had no editing skills or camera skills. And he had like all the cool cameras and all these amazing editing skills, but, was someone who preferred like capturing stories rather than kind of creating them out of whole cloth. So I remember AMC back in like 2012 or 2013, the network had invited me to create a pilot for a show about hunting rare books. And I was like, you always say, oh, well, yes, of course I'll do that. But then as soon as you hang up the phone, it's like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? So I said, who do I know with the camera? Who do I know that can help film this? And Ian was there for me. He and another buddy of ours, he joined us, the 3 of us. We went to New York for a long weekend, and we filmed this documentary right there on the spot. It was incredible. That's another story for another time. But what's funny is around 2015, which is when Ian started filming, I was one of the first person, if not the first person, you reached out to saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing this video of our old soccer coach, Mike McGraw. He's been coach now for like 30 years and he's getting close to retirement. He's never won a state title. Lewiston has never won a state title, but I've got a good feeling about this team. He said, I think, as a love letter to coach, I'm going to be on the sidelines with my camera and cut together a little film for him. He said, would you help me with it? And unfortunately, I felt so bad because he helped me with my pilot. I should be there for Ian. But I was like, oh my gosh, I'm just starting my thesis process at Harvard right now. It's like, if there's a way I can help down the line, certainly. And, he and I were still, in regular contact on a weekly basis. I just didn't have the time, though, to help him with that project. So he filmed the season. He cut everything together. He put together this amazing trailer, the one that you saw. And overnight, it garnered 1.9 million views on Facebook,
Wow.
and it went viral. And then the next thing you know, HBO, CNN, CBS, NBC, they were calling Ian for all of these interviews because, to your point, I think just to tell people a little bit more about what it's about, Maine for a long time was the oldest and the whitest state in the nation. And Lewiston, which is my hometown and Ian's hometown, it's the town that was really economically depressed when we were growing up. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of poverty. There was just, it was a city that could really use a boost. It was an old mill town. But then when the mills closed up, 20 some odd, 30 some odd years ago, a lot of the town's opportunity went with it. So the mayors at the time decided that we were going to open our doors to refugees from other countries, primarily from Somalia. And Lewiston was actually the site of one of the largest refugee resettlements in the world. And, a big refugee resettlement like that can be tricky for any town. But again, when you have an economically depressed town in the oldest and whitest state, there was a lot of tension. And I remember, like the Ku Klux Klan all of a sudden coming into Maine, who had never been, focused in Maine before. And it was a really interesting time for our city because there were dividing lines that were formed, people who were very welcoming of the refugees, and then other people who were like, there are so few jobs here. Why are these outsiders taking my jobs? Or, and you always heard the conspiracy theories, oh, they come here and they get free cars and just all these unfounded sort of things. But what's amazing now, it's been 20 years since that refugee resettlement. Thanks to that refugee resettlement, Lewiston is now like one of the safest, most vibrant cities in all of Maine. It's truly an incredible case study for what opening your doors to immigrants and refugees can really do for a community. And, we're so much the better for it here in Lewiston. So what's interesting though, when all of these Somali refugees came in to Lewiston, at the refugee camps, the only thing to do to pass the time was play soccer. So a lot of these youngsters that were coming in were joining our soccer teams and really creating, just these amazing teams that had a lot of, potential to go for championships and everything. So what's really interesting, the season that Ian captured, it was a team of half native-born white players and half newly settled immigrant players who came together to go on for an undefeated season. The first time that Lewiston had ever won a state championship in soccer, the first time Coach McGraw had ever won a state championship. But what's interesting was when Ian put together that great story about Coach McGraw, you have to tell the story of the players. And then all of a sudden you have to tell the story, well, how did these players come together and where are they from? And what really sparked everything, Derek, was that Ian's trailer hit at the same time. It was within days of then candidate Trump announcing he was planning on instituting a Muslim ban in the United States. It was at the exact same time that the Syrian refugee crisis was at its height. And all of these Syrian refugees were trying to find homes in new countries, and a lot of countries were turning their backs on them. And it was at the exact same time that Brexit was entering this global lexicon. Why do we care about others? Let's close ourselves off from the world. So Ian's little story about how, these native-born white players and foreign-born Black players came together to create this amazing team, this one team, and united a divided community, it resonated. So that's a pretty long story short about what made it trigger. But then Ian, again, he's a great guy for cinematography and, rolling the camera and capturing things, but he never expected to catch lightning in the bottle the way that he did. So when it was time to actually start shopping the film around, I was done my thesis by then. And he said, hey, I could really use some help with the storytelling aspect. And that's where I was able to come in and really help Ian. And we actually went back to start and broke everything down. And I said, okay, let's move this 3-second clip here, and then that 5-second clip there, and then let's add in this thing, and let's do a reshoot so we can bring in some more context. And we told a broader, more fuller story. And since then, I mean, we have some really exciting news coming up soon about one team that we'll be able to share once it's locked in with a distributor. But we've been everywhere from Apple TV, where they were actually considering having us in their launch slate, but we did a few public viewings of the film prior to going to them. And then Apple TV was like, oh no, we only actually share like original content that's never been seen anywhere before. And we're like, oh no, you know.
Oh, geez.
I know, right? But yeah, that was really interesting. So I was able to come on board as basically a writer, where I took all of Ian's dozens, if not hundreds of hours of footage and chopped it up and told a story from it. And also a producer that's taking it around and helping him get it in front of a lot of big executives, Jason Blum, Tom Hanks. This film has really captured a lot of attention. We've gotten audiences with some great people. And yeah, we'll hopefully have some exciting news to announce with that pretty soon.
That's amazing on so many different aspects. The first one is you mentioning you didn't have any camera skills or editing skills, but your friend Ian did. But you had the storytelling and the ability to shop the film around. And that's just a great example of the collaboration of filmmaking. And it's my favorite aspect of the whole process. And I've said that ad nauseum on the show. Film cannot work if it's not a collaborative effort. It takes so many cogs to make the machine work. And they all have to work together in order to make the machine move. So knowing someone who had skills that you didn't, and likewise, you just shows, and it's great that it just kind of worked out that way. So yeah, that's awesome.
Frodo's not making it to Mordor without Boromir. And
that's
Gimli,
exactly.
and you need that whole fellowship, and it's so true in the filmmaking process and the storytelling process. And that's one of my biggest pieces of advice for people who are maybe aspiring to get into this industry. It's network. Get to know as many people as you can. I am so fortunate. I knew no one about 10 years ago. But again, now I've got like dozens, literally, of television studios that reach out to me when they're like, hey, we've got some money and we want to develop a show about Charles Dickens or, Victorian, ghost hunting or, Shakespeare. You got anything on Shakespeare? We're looking to sell something to the BBC. And I had none of those connections years ago, but after 10 years of going around and pitching bibliophiles and trying to make a name with, Shakespeare's Paraliptic characters and Quest for the Antidote, a lot of doors start opening, and even meeting someone like Eric. And now he and I are working on like 3 or 4 really cool projects that'll be coming up down the line that would never have been possible if you weren't open to networking and also actively looking for those people, exactly like you said, that complement you, that complete you. I needed an Ian needed a Tom for one team, but for every movie, you need a whole team of really talented people to come together. And when that happens, you create a beautiful piece of art.
Well, and even going off on the collaborative thing is finding people who are more experienced than you. And, not to be so blunt about it, but to find people that are better than you because they'll make you better.
Exactly. I mean, I was a teacher for a long time, and, I love being a student for that very reason. I enjoyed every second of every class, and that's why I'm a lifelong learner still to this day. We were talking about masterclass earlier. I want to learn everything I can from Aaron Sorkin. I want to learn everything I can from Neil Gaiman. And I think it's going to be that way, for the rest of my life. And I think that's the thing that artists really need to worry about. If they ever get to the point where they feel like there's nothing left to learn, or I've got this, and they start settling on their laurels or really, settling into a rut, their art is going to suffer and their career will probably suffer, as will their aspirations.
I can't remember who said this quote, but if I remember it correctly, it's when the butterflies in your stomach are gone, that's the day that you need to move on. Because even, when I still do podcasts, I still get that little bit of, nervousness, like, oh, how is it going to go? Is it going to go well? Is it going to suck? Things like that. If I don't worry about that, like if I just be like, I'll just talk to the person for 20 minutes, then I know that's the day that I need to stop podcasting.
Yeah, that is very sound advice, Derek.
So you mentioned you had some exciting things coming up. Is there anything coming up that you can talk about as far as future projects, whether it's books, film, anything like that?
That is a great question. Before getting on with you here tonight, I was like, what can I talk about? I'm under NDA for this. That's not quite a done deal yet. I've got, this. I would say the big things to keep an eye out for next would probably be some expansion of Quest for the Antidote. It's a fun family board game, but what's great about this is one of those projects that when you find that right character, boom, all of a sudden it blows open a world of possibilities for you. Back in 2011, I just said to myself on a dare, it was New Year's, I said, okay, I'm going to try to do like 10 cool things this year, things that I've always wanted to do. And I'm really into board games. So I said, I'm going to create a board game. So over the next year, I started to develop this game. All right, what's it going to be about? What sort of elements and games do I like? All right, I'm going to have this and have that. So I came up with this really cool, sort of mechanical game, but I didn't have much of a story to put on it. It was going to be a game where characters were going to be traveling out and looking for different things that they were going to have to put together in order to win. Well, what could they be looking for, and why would they be looking? Okay, maybe they're looking. Maybe they're poisoned. So what do you look for if you're poisoned? Items for an antidote, and well, where do you get those items? Obviously, you have to travel out across a vast and dangerous landscape. So I kind of had those basics, and it sounded pretty cool. But I needed my big bad. I needed my Darth Vader, my Lord Voldemort, and it just wasn't coming to me. Is it going to be a dark wizard? Is it going to be an evil witch? And one day, and again, this kind of goes back to that whole thing of always be open, always have your antennas on, because you never know where inspiration is going to be coming from. I was reading some of the driest Shakespeare scholarship for my master's thesis, and I saw there was this little footnote to a play from the 1700s written by Racine about Mithridates, the Poison King. And I said, oh, hello, who do we have here? What, the Poison King? And there's this real life, king from ancient Greek history. He was the king of Pontus. His name was Mithridates. And he was dubbed the Poison King because as a child, he was at a royal feast and he saw his father drink from a cup of wine and die right on the table in front of him. His cup had been poisoned, and young Mithridates in that moment looked around the table, a table surrounded by family members, friends, trusted advisors, visiting dignitaries, and he didn't know who did this to his father. And now in that moment, he inherits his father's crown, and he's worried that this might happen to him next. A fascinating historical figure, because what he then goes on to do is he dedicates his life to studying toxicology. He, experimented on enemies and on prisoners, all these different concoctions. And supposedly, according to history, although, there must be some legend and myth built in there, but he created this serum, Mithridatum, that made him impervious to any, it's the universal antidote. He could drink down all sorts of poison and not be affected by it. And I'm like, how has no one ever told a story about this guy? This is amazing. So he became that big bad that not only tied together the elements of my board game, but then said, oh my gosh, this is like a book series. This guy he is the Darth Vader of a fantasy world, And so yes, Quest for the Antidote, I'd say keep an eye out for that as we start to explore things in animated television, and also books and potentially even feature films. And then also keep an eye out for some unscripted docuseries. I have 2 or 3 that are in various stages of pre-production right now, some with production companies in England, some here in the United States. Likely they'll be about Shakespeare. So keep that in mind. And then also Eric Bischoff and I are working on a couple of really cool wrestling related projects that I think are really going to make a lot of wrestling fans happy. So stay tuned for that.
That's fantastic. So much cool stuff in the works. And it's funny you mentioned, just the Poison King name alone is just so cool. You're like, the Poison King. Like, you hear it and you're like, man, that sounds really cool. I want to know more about it.
And getting back to what you said earlier, Derek, read up on King Mithridates, the Poison King, because history is more fascinating than anything I could have come up with for this hero. He's an amazing figure, and certainly a figure that can transition well from history into fiction, and again, just be this fascinating character who starts off as, a hero, this poor little prince who saw his father murdered, but then, who over time, being paranoid and ingesting all of these drugs, basically becomes like an addled and crazed maniac, at least in my world, in my version of the story. So yeah, some cool stuff to come there.
No, I dig that. That's exciting. And I know you had alluded to it a few minutes ago, but as we start to wrap up here, what's a piece of advice that you could give to someone who's aspiring to be, whether it's a writer, Anybody who wants to work in the film industry? I know you had mentioned, networking, but is there like one other big piece of advice that you could give?
So networking is certainly huge. And along those same lines, take any opportunity you can to learn. Again, exactly what you said. I feel like we're twins, Derek. Where have you been all my life? Exactly like what you were saying earlier. Look for those people who are better than you, because they will only make you better. Look for people who are where you want to be, and you will get there eventually if you follow their advice. Have a thick skin. And be open to criticism, because that's the only way you're going to grow and learn. Muscle doesn't build unless you tear it a little bit and stretch it to its extremes. But at the same time, be confident in your ideas too. If you have something that you can't shake, you can't get it out of your head, you're thinking about it every waking hour, and sometimes even when you're asleep, follow that dream as far as you can, because the journey is certainly well worth it, and the destination is too. So those would be some of my pieces of advice. Don't give up, network. And the other cool thing too, people are really nice and giving of their time. Like, I'm amazed that Eric Bischoff would even, give me like a moment's notice, let alone say, hey, come on and do a podcast. Hey, let's collaborate on this. Hey, let's collaborate on that. For that Quest for the Antidote project that's coming up, I have an Emmy-winning writer and also a longtime Disney executive who are helping to bring that world to life. These are people who, like, what? Like, why are they helping this guy from the backwoods of Maine? They're helping because I asked for their help, and they saw the potential and they saw the drive. So I would say, beat down all those doors, try to meet as many people as you can. People are much nicer than you think, and just don't give up. I've gotten so much rejection and have so much scar tissue. I'm bulletproof now, So those would be some parting pieces of advice from me.
And if that doesn't inspire you, I don't know what will. Last question. Do you have any website or social media you'd like to plug so the listeners can follow you?
Yeah, great question. So tomdeschenes.net is my personal website, TOMDESCHENES. .net. And also I do have an Instagram, Insta Tommy D. I will say though, I'm horrible at social media. I post like 3 things a year, so I barely have any followers or any engagement. I have so much other stuff going on. But that is something that everyone from Eric Bischoff to my agent is saying, you have to like start building up like a following or fan base. You have to start getting into social media. So one of these days, I'm sure I'll launch a Twitter and a Facebook account. And but yes, for now, anyone who's interested in learning more about the latest and greatest can visit tomdeschenes.net, or you can follow me on Instagram and see my 3 or 4 posts a year.
That's fantastic. Well, Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show to have this chat. And anytime you want to come back to plug anything else, you're more than welcome.
I'm going to take you up on that. Derek, I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at D-Diamond Podcast. If you want to subscribe to the show, it's on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you can get podcasts. Just search for The Derek Diamond Experience. And thank you, as always, to my close friends, the Unicorn Wranglers, for providing the theme music for the podcast. You can check out all their music on Apple Music, Google Play, and Spotify. That's going to do it for this week's episode. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you for tuning into another awesome episode of the Derek Diamond Experience, and we'll see you guys back here next Thursday.